I'm Andrew Wallace, and welcome to the We've Got a Problem podcast, where each week we explore inspiring stories of struggles, success, and solutions to prevalent problems, and how our guests have turned a problem into an opportunity. Today, I'm joined by Claire Chandler. She's an executive advisor and business mentor with almost 30 years of experience, helping business owners, leaders, and acquirers grow, scale, and create value while building a culture that reinforces that same growth. Claire, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you were not born in the human resources, consultant, executive advisor, business mentor world. I'm sure you had a childhood, a mother, a father, those kinds of things. We don't need to cover that far into history, but give us a little bit of background. How did you get into this line of work? How'd you get your start? How'd you get to be here?
You mean how did I spend 20 years in corporate America after swearing I would never work in corporate America? And how did I get into human resources after swearing I could never work in HR?
Yes, that would be yes. Tell me that.
Yeah.
How?
Yeah. So I am the product of two parents who are as non-corporate as it gets. My mom was a school teacher, now retired. My dad was a small business owner. He worked for a big company for, in my memory, 10 days. He swears it was 10 years, but it flew. So I was not somebody who was groomed to migrate toward corporate. And yet, when I graduated college, that's where the opportunities were. And so I spent a couple of decades in corporate, most recently in human resources. And as I always say, I sort of snuck in the side door of HR. They were looking for a head of training and development. I had been doing some training in a previous role in that company and came on board into HR. And then that role evolved and grew exponentially into all things talent management. So everything from executive coaching to leadership development to career development. And I was hooked. And I spent the last year in corporate migrating toward a full cycle HR executive role to really groom me for running HR someday. I was a potential successor to the overall executive vice president of HR. It was great experience, and it drove home for me that full cycle HR management was just not my jam. Loved my team, loved the company, loved the culture, didn't want to go in that direction. So it was the impetus that I needed in 2011 to strike out on my own. I spent those first 2 years literally walking the earth, taking whatever work that I could to try to narrow down to what was I going to specialize in as a business. So I didn't found my company Talent Boost until 2013. So we're coming up on 10 years, which is kind of a big deal.
Congratulations.
Thank you for that. And, it did take me a while to really zone in on, of all the things I could do, what did I really want to do? What did I truly believe in?
Yep.
And I narrowed into this niche or this niche where I advise executives within corporate America on how to be better leaders, be more followable, and build cultures that truly support the growth and the sustainability of the business.
Yes. Yes. So, I suppose that's always the big question, right? So many of us have had experiences with large corporations, the way that they manage their HR, their culture, all these kinds of things should be tying together. In my mind, right? We should have a connection here between the people and the culture. And
that's just crazy talk. What do you mean, Andrew?
What? I know. It's nuts. Absolutely nuts. You should be jailed for these thoughts. But culture is such an amorphous concept, and one that I feel like is very difficult to build, especially to build correctly, and that it's something that now, more than it was when I was in corporate America, perhaps, is becoming something that people are focusing on. But that's partially because of a tight job market and things like that they want to differentiate themselves from others. I think big tech kind of started that with, we're going to build this a certain culture that's the hard charging, whatever it is, move fast, break stuff, Facebook thing, or we all have fun at work and it's a party, and as if anybody wants to go to one more mandatory barbecue. But I mean, how should companies be thinking about creating a culture? How can we do it better? How can we create a culture that fosters growth, innovation, all those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think it's the key question, right? And I think to your point, people have struggled up to this point to arrive at a common definition for what culture is that transcends just it's a squishy HR term that HR bandies about to make themselves look more strategic. The reality is, and most organizations have finally caught on, that culture is foundational. Culture goes beyond just the working environment that you provide to employees. Culture is truly woven through the fabric of everyone you bring on board, everyone you advance, how work gets done, where work gets done, why people not only join your company, but why they stay.
Yes.
And I think organizations, even though we all still struggle to put a fine point on what culture truly is, most organizations, if they're paying attention and aren't still running their business from under a rock, have finally embraced the fact that culture, that the more fit your culture is, the more healthy it is, the more positive, the stronger it is, the more that's going to translate into a bottom line that is also positive and strong and fit and sustainable, right? And I think so organizations are catching up to this fact, which is great. I think the other part that leaders of more forward-leaning organizations are starting to understand is the biggest impact on a culture is the behavior of the leadership. Culture had been traditionally misunderstood as something that bubbles up organically from the boots on the ground. And in fact, the opposite is true. Leaders shape culture. Leaders truly shape culture. If the behavior of the leaders is such that they are toxic, that they reward gossip, that they reward throwing people under the bus, that is the culture that will manifest, and that is the culture that will take root.
Yeah.
And as I'm sure you have seen, because you mentioned you've done a bit of time in corporate, I call myself a corporate survivor, so totally relate to that. We understand this. We understand that toxic cultures tend to fester faster. There's a soundbite for you. Than cultures that are positive and built on the enthusiastic, collaborative contribution of the people that are there. But that, in fact, is the holy grail. That's the quest.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I can only go back to my own experience, though limited though it was. But the culture that the organization that I had, that I worked for, was not toxic in the pure sense of the word, but it certainly wasn't a fit for me. And despite attempts to change it on the behalf of very well-meaning executives, the culture did not shift as long as I was there. And it was one of, look, I arrived for work at 8 a.m. and we left work at 10:38 p.m. more nights than I can count. Why 10:38 and why that precise time? Because that's when the last ferry left Weehawken, New Jersey to get back to New York. And if you missed the Lincoln Harbor ferry, then you were going to have to take a black car home. So, the company did not want to pay for that. The fact that we worked all these hours and that was kind of the culture we had of just staying late and getting the work done and all those kinds of things, and didn't produce more than we did, tells me that there's a little bit of a problem there. And several people, I worked with a lot of great people. I loved the team. It's a bit like your experience in that I liked the people I worked with. I liked what we did, and I believed in the mission. For me, it was a situation where I left and was no longer there. Now, this was 2008, and there were other things at play, but they could have perhaps, and I think in retrospect, done some things differently. The question then becomes, what are concrete steps that leaders can take when faced with a desire to change the culture, a belief that, yes, it's got to start with them, how do you do that? How do you kind of work through that minefield?
Yeah, I think it starts with an intentional commitment. And what I mean by that is, just in the example from your own experience that you referenced, there was this, let's call it what it is. We didn't call it this back in 2008. The cultural norm of working until 10:38 p.m. That was the expectation. And the only reason that you had a hard stop was because they weren't going to pay for you to get a car service across the river, right? And so I think it has to start with the leaders, and there has to be an intentional commitment to take one step back and take a look more holistically at the culture you're perpetuating, the business model, the way work is getting done. And it has to start with the leaders. Yeah. It cannot start with, we are going to empower a cross-functional task force to look into how our culture could be stronger. And we're going to endorse that because we're culture champions at the top. But we're going to go back to our corner offices and our car service and chiefs of staff and just, continue to do things the way we've always done them. So I think there has to be an intentional commitment to take stock, right? But the second piece of that, which I find with the leaders that I advise, this is the step that intuitively they nod their heads and go, yes, 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 we absolutely have to do this. But it's much harder to do. Leaders have to be radically honest about their current state. It's so easy and fun to project this vision of what life will be like when. And if we are not, as organizations, especially as executive leaders, radically honest about where we are starting from, the ground under your feet will perpetually shift, and you will never get to that holy grail or that, nirvana that you are painting the picture of for your people. And that's where the culture shows its cracks. Yeah. And that's where the disconnect between what you promise as a brand and what you deliver as a company starts to become even more divergent.
Yeah.
So I think those are the first two steps for leaders. They have to intentionally commit to, we are going to take the time and take the breath and take the distance to get some more holistic perspective. And we have to be radically honest with ourselves about where we're starting from.
Yes. Yes. And I think, radically honest, radical candor across the organization is probably a good cultural value to have. What is it? Kim Scott, the book Radical Candor was an eye opener for me when starting to think through how to foster this culture of openness, honesty, clarity, and in a supportive fashion, which is something that I didn't directly experience, but can totally buy into. And being honest with yourself of where you are and what's going on. Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, part of the next question becomes, you buy a company that has a totally different culture from your own. That's the way that business gets done, of course. Or you're in a company that's acquired. That process is full of landmines to step on and mess up. And I have read, and this goes back years, so it may be out of date, but that a huge percentage, something like 80%, let's say, and I'm making the numbers up, but a huge percentage of acquisitions are not actually accretive to the bottom line because, say, the synergies that they forecast don't materialize, the cultures don't integrate, you have people who are talking cross purposes, all those kinds of things. What do you do? How do you unscrew this up?
This is the portion of the interview where we're laughing because it's not funny. You're absolutely right. The statistic has borne out year over year, and it is 80% is not off. The statistic is somewhere between 70 and 90% of all mergers and acquisitions fail. And I'm using air quotes here for those who are just listening to the audio of this. Fail can be a wide-ranging term, right? It does not mean that one acquisition or merger, when it does not produce value, will bring your business under. But if that becomes your model for growth and you don't figure out how to do it successfully, it will absolutely destroy value to the point of destroying your business. So 80% is right there in the wheelhouse. I often, if I really want to inspire some fear and create a burning platform for executives to take actions, will say up to 90% of all M&As fail.
Okay.
Interestingly, even mergers or acquisitions of complementary businesses have just as high a risk of failure. There are many reasons for that, but most of the large, impactful reasons have to do with culture. When organizations do not pay attention to cultural integration, they are doomed to fail. I don't care how complementary of businesses you are trying to combine. I know of one that is quite recent. They're about 2 years, no, check that, about 1 year into their merger. Two complementary businesses. In fact, one big competitor bought out the other big competitor. Same industry, they go after the same target market. They have a lot of the same contracts that get interchanged over the years. You would think complementary businesses, they're going to dovetail together and weave into this beautiful tapestry. We're not going to miss a beat, and we're going to just grow exponentially. I know it's going to shock you, so glad you're sitting down, Andrew. But there were bumps in the road, right?
Just a few. Yeah, I'm sure.
You can talk to parents of identical twins, and they will tell you that maybe you can't tell the difference between my two identical twins, but I can as their mother or their father. And they are going to, even if they're raised in the same household, by the same parents, go to the same schools, are put on the same types of teams, they're going to be different. They're going to develop their own personalities, right? And so if we know that about identical twins, why are we surprised that complementary businesses coming together need a little bit of nurturing, need some focused attention on bringing the best of those two cultures together? And so if we solve that, if we fix the cultural integration, if we actually spend time on blending, not mashing up two cultures, that statistic about the failure rate of M&As would drop considerably.
Yeah. The difficult thing for me to stomach is how people don't look at the statistic and go, well, clearly we've got to focus on this. Are companies not focusing on it at all, or not doing it right? I mean, are they trying and failing miserably, or are they just turning a blind eye to it?
So I think it's a little bit of both. I think pre-deal close, during the due diligence process, so much time and attention is focused on what I would call the tangible side of the deal, right? The bottom line financials, the customer backlog, the head count, the litigation history, all the things that we can boil down into an Excel spreadsheet.
Sure.
Because it's more quantifiable. It's easier to look at that and size that up and say, okay, this is where this the balance sheet, if you will, of company X will integrate with company Y. And that's all wonderful, but it actually only tells a minority portion of the story. There's other research, and the source of this research escapes me now. I believe it was actually the NYU Stern School of Business did a study around what actually drives the book value of a business. And what they found was that traditionally it was those tangible types of assets, the financial picture, the customer backlog, the headcount, et cetera. But what they found was over time, and even as recently as the last couple of decades, what really drives the majority of business value is intangible assets. Yeah. Your intellectual property, the institutional knowledge, your brand, all of those sorts of things drive the majority of the business value. I don't care what industry you're in. It is more of the intangible side. But the second part to get to what you surmised is organizations are starting to understand that that's true, but they're still backing away from, well, that can't be measured, so we're just going to have to resolve that once we get in there post deal.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of the reality at play here.
Yeah. I feel like if I were buying a company, and of course I am nowhere near buying a company.
Oh, let's do it. Come on.
Let's just do it together. But if I were buying a company, I almost look at it as I'm buying human beings in a sense. I'm buying people. I'm buying the culture. I'm buying the people who know these things, because all that organizational knowledge, all that it's beyond just headcount. I'm buying the team that did it, that's doing these things, that deals with the customers, that has all these things going on. So it would be foolish to ignore that fact. And yet they go, I can't measure it, I can't quantify. And certainly I don't want to be in a position where I go, well, we can't lose Claire, because if we lose Claire, we've got no business. Right.
Well, and part of the problem too, I mean, let's be real. When you're talking about a merger or an acquisition, you have very limited access to the depth of people within the workforce, right? Sure. It is a very black box type of an operation where you are only allowed to talk to certain people at the upper echelon. So it is very difficult to try to ascertain what is the depth, what's the quality, what's the capacity of the people that you are You are
Yeah.
buying. And if you're uncomfortable with saying you're buying people, let's talk about intangible assets because it's the same thing. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
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 However, as soon as possible after the deal closes, you've got to get in there and not just assess the people, but actually interact with them. And I think, and I know because I've seen it, this is part of where mergers and acquisitions also break down, because rather than going in and focusing on the cultural integration, and the first way you do that is focusing on strategic alignment. The first thing people do is go in there, and what do? They change out, wait for it, the payroll system.
Right.
And I know that sounds like a ridiculous example, but it is the most common first step that a buyer does when they acquire a company. They say, well, we've got to harmonize the payroll system. And it's like, you don't understand how intimately familiar workforces are with their payroll system. And they're going to assume that you're going to screw up their paycheck. Let's be honest. And if you want to see somebody resist change, which is a human reflex to do, go mess with their paycheck as the very first impression that you make, right? Even if you get it right, it is a very hard change and people are going to resist it. So, I talk to investors, I talk to serial acquirers, I talk to big companies all the time, and they go to me, they go, Claire, like, we've got this justifiable reason why we bought or merged with this company. And we've got this brilliant growth strategy. They always call it brilliant, this value creation plan. Sure. So why are people resisting all the changes we want to make? And it's like, okay, I want you to play back that sentence for me and tell me what was wrong with it. They're going to resist change because it's human nature to do that. And because you didn't try to relate to them as a human and get them on board with why this merger or acquisition will bring value, not just to the company, but to them.
Right.
When you skip that step, of course, they're going to dig their heels in.
Well, yeah. Why? These people don't know my business. These people don't have any concept of why we do what we do. It's just the guys out there in the ivory tower up there on Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue. I don't care. Madison. Pick an avenue, and then they sorry. They don't know what they're talking about. They have no idea. And now they want to change this, they want to change that, and they want to do this, and they think we should do this. They don't know what we do. They don't have any concept. Just leave it alone. Just keep doing it. Or better yet, just give. So, yes, absolutely. We'll do that. Don't do that. Don't do what we just agreed to.
Well, and it's interesting because you can talk to executive leaders about the importance of bringing their people along the journey, right? Yeah. As soon as possible after the deal closes, as soon as it is appropriate for you to talk to the employees, you want to get them on board with why this deal came together and why this brought value. And what I find is executive leaders sometimes resist that because they're not sure how to articulate it.
Right.
And, so one of the problems with that is that the people that have been involved in that deal, in that merger or acquisition, have been living in it for probably months, right? So for them, they already know the ins and outs of why that deal took place. And without exception, usually they have given some very meaningful input into the process. So they're already knee deep in the why, right? They're already aligned with the strategy. But now you have to go out and convince the workforce that this is something that they should cooperate with in terms of cultural integration, in terms of harmonizing processes, in terms of changing out the payroll and all that sort of thing. And what executive leaders need to understand is they have to contextualize the reason for the change. Right. They've been sitting with it for months. Their workforce is now getting the news like a splash of cold water in their face. You have to contextualize for them why this aligns with our long-term vision for the company.
Right.
And a lot of them skip that step or at least undervalue it.
Well, I'm sure an incalculable number of stories about this done badly. I want to talk a little bit about growth because I don't want to get away. I want to step away from culture and the acquisition minefield that we're talking about. What do you think the biggest hurdle to growth is for companies, your clients, those kinds of things? What's holding them back?
In my experience, the biggest hurdle is, and this applies to startups that are trying to get to that next stage where they're no longer startups. This is large organizations that are trying to go from regional to national. And this is certainly for organizations that are growing through M&A. And I find this as well in my own practice because I am a solopreneur. Yes, I have a network of partners I bring in, but day in and day out, I'm a solopreneur.
Right.
You cannot scale until you standardize what's working, until you put in processes and systems and structure that can replicate success and engineers out inefficiencies. And the longer you wait to do that, and the bigger you get before you standardize and get really, really ruthless in terms of consistency with what you do and how you do it, when you go to try to grow, stuff starts to break.
Right.
You see this with startups looking to sort of expand their team beyond that first, you know how it is with startups. The founder hires some inner circle and they're extremely fluid. There are no real rules. There's no bureaucracy. Decision-making is done around the bar at the Friday happy hour, which is a standing thing, right? But when you go to grow and you have that second tier of employees that surround you, they expect you to have had some of these things figured out. Yeah. They expect you to be more professional and more structured and more consistent with how you hire, how you onboard, how you set expectations, how you provide feedback, and how you recognize and reward your talent. And the same lesson goes for the larger and growing organizations. If you don't standardize the how, because there's a lot of other things that are the wild cards, right? It's the who you bring in and all of that. But how work gets done, you have to standardize and make as consistent as possible so that you can have performance that you can rely upon.
Yes. 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 I mean, I can't agree with that more because we've got examples of that across the corporate spectrum. We've watched it in startups, especially tech startups who've done it badly and some who've done it beautifully to put policies, procedures, those kinds of things in place that make people know that it's almost like commoditizing the process. McDonald's is the king of these kinds of things, right? That you get a McDonald's hamburger in any McDonald's, it's going to be a McDonald's hamburger. You know what you're going to get. Right. You may not even want it, but that's what you're going to get.
But at least it's consistent.
Right. It's consistent. So, and they have done it down to, and I'm not saying you should do this with your business processes per se. You don't want to, and nothing is cranking widgets anymore. There's a lot of knowledge work that goes into play. So we're not going exactly that direction, but to have a way that you operate, that you do with how you hire, how you onboard, how you conduct yourself in business, what the corporate standards are for everything from top to bottom, that you've done that thinking before you get into, well,
you know, and it's interesting because you sort of reflected that back and you talked about policies and procedures and processes. And some people listening to this, their reflex is going to be to say, well, you're going to stifle innovation if you standardize too much. And I would argue the opposite is true, because if people can rely upon the rules of the game through which work is getting done, that there are rules that apply to everybody, that there are best practices that we can go to and sort of refer to as a jumping off point. Well, now innovation can actually flourish because I'm not starting from ground zero every single time.
Right.
I can start from a basis of what has already worked and grow from there. I heard this quote years and years ago, and it always stuck with me. There is no longer any such thing as an original thought. And I want to refute that, but I haven't been able to because I think it's true. I think we all stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us, the processes that were invented. So our ability to innovate is actually restricted by the lack of a standard platform from which we can grow.
Yep. I can absolutely see that. And I think it's one of those foundational things. Like you have to build a strong foundation to build a skyscraper. You can't just walk in and start putting stuff in the ground and go, well, we'll figure it out as we go along. It's like once you have that, then you can achieve greatness. But without it, you can't really.
That's right.
So I've got a couple more questions for you. We're kind of coming to the end. We've had a fantastic conversation already, but I want to know, what you think, and this can be very specific to your individual niche or broad for the entire world, something you just think is bizarre. But what do you think the biggest fallacy is that everybody buys into, that at the end of the day, it's just total BS? What's way overrated?
Other than the myth that professional wrestling is real.
Yes.
I have to go back to culture. I think the biggest myth is that culture bubbles up organically, and so we don't have to pay any conscious attention to it. That the right norms and the right behaviors and the right results are just going to bubble up from the bottom. I have seen that time and time again disproven, because it doesn't matter how great the talent is that you hire if the leaders stifle that and reinforce a culture of conformity, or reinforce toxic behavior, or don't reinforce the types of behaviors they want to see repeated. Your culture is going to erode. So I have to come back to that as the biggest myth.
Yeah, I can't agree with that anymore either, because I see it as a huge issue. It just one it's the elephant in the room that's not being appropriately dealt with. But on the other side of it, what do you think the most underrated concept is that people overlook? And it can be the same thing, but what do you think people are missing? What do we need more?
I mean, it's easy for me to answer that and say it's still culture, but let's go even granular. It's your people, right? I think one of the many lessons we got out of COVID was most organizations figured out how to get work done, even if they couldn't be in the same location Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And some organizations said, yay, COVID's over, everybody back to work, without any sort of rhyme or reason as to why. And I think that's where we started to see the great resignation, the great talent shortage, a lot of this sort of underperformance, where organizations just rigidly try to reapply the norms of the past prior to this global pandemic. And I think more future-leaning organizations are understanding that the war for talent that we predicted 20 years ago is upon us. And the best organizations are understanding that we have to figure out ways to leverage communities of talent and not necessarily just amass this huge full-time workforce and hold them accountable to very rigid black and white job descriptions.
Yeah.
I have seen big global organizations starting to look at the gig economy as the wave of the future for staffing their talent pool. And it's performed wonderfully, because you can now leverage talent in more of a project or outcome-based way, rather than staff up and then not know what to do with your staff when, the big peaks are over.
Right.
So, I think that's kind of the biggest thing that's underrated, is really looking at your people as a talent pool and putting them in a position to excel, and fostering cultures and communities of collaboration to help them do that.
Yep. I think that's fantastic advice. Folks, thank you. Claire, thank you so much for joining me. Folks, if you want to know more about Claire, check out her website, clairechandler.net, and follow her on social media. Links to everything are in the show notes, as always. Until next time, I'm Andrew Wallace, and we don't have a problem. We have an opportunity.